Welcome to In, a podcast series dedicated to contemporary visual art practices. In is broadcast by New Local Space, a microgallery and contemporary art initiative in Kingston, Jamaica, and a subsidiary of audio production house Creative Sounds. This episode is brought to you with the generous support of the British Council Caribbean and will be hosted by a writer and independent curator, Nicole Smythe-Johnson. Today, we have the second part of a conversation about ideas and creative practices focused on the concept of decolonizing nature, with guests Cooking Sections, Susanne Winterling, and James Hutchinson. Cooking Sections is a duo of spatial practitioners, Daniel Fernandez Pascual and Alan Schwab, based in London, who explore systems that organize the world through food. Using installation, performance, mapping, and video, their research-based practice tests the overlapping boundaries between the visual arts, architecture, and geopolitics. Their work has been exhibited internationally at the U.S. Pavilion for the 2014 Venice Architecture Biennale, the New National Gallery, and Haus der Kulturen der Welt in Berlin, Storefront for Art and Architecture, CA2M, the New Institute in Rotterdam, University of Technology Sydney, Performa 17, the Oslo Architecture Triennale, the Delfina Foundation, Atlas Arts, and the 13th Sharjah Biennale. In 2016, they opened the Empire Remains shop in London. They currently teach an architecture studio at the Royal College of Art. James Hutchinson was co-founder and co-director of the Salford Restoration Office. SRO made solo exhibitions with Corner House Manchester, Castlefield Gallery Manchester, and Tramway Glasgow, and research projects including Centrifuge and the Whitworth Cabinet. He co-curated Jeremy Della's exhibition All That Is Solid Melts into Air for Hayward Touring London. He's a founding member of Chapter 13, a new curatorial cooperative in Glasgow. James's recent projects include Rumours of a New Planet, Collective Gallery Edinburgh, Archive Transmission Gallery Glasgow, and Proposal for a Warehouse or Towards a Museum of Reorganization, part of How to Turn the World by Hand, Collective Gallery Edinburgh, and PIST Istanbul. Susanne Winterling has a practice nurtured by a collective background and studies in philosophy, focus on artificial intelligence and ecofeminism, sensually playfully rearranging parts and perception structures that form our bodily experience. The work enhances our perceptual and critical consciousness. A recent body of work centers around technology, biology, and favors the haptic and poetic as a critical investigation against the nature-culture divide, dealing with the phenomena of bioluminescent systems of knowledge and power, as well as rights of nature. The work has been shown recently in the Lulenial, Mexico, Nature After Nature Castle, The Climatic Unconsciousness at Remai Modern, and Corruption Everybody Knows at eFlux, New York. The Radical Incomplete series in Kunstverein Langenhagen, Hellstorm Chronicle at Barbara Weiss Gallery Berlin, Contour Biennial Belgium, Tidal Ectics TBA 21 Vienna, and Inventory of Shimmers MIT Boston.
Thank you so much for being here today, guys. And I want to start out by just hearing a little bit about your work. And I would love if everybody could tell me a little bit about what kind of relationships, ecological and psychological, between the body and the landscape does the viewer encounter in your work.
It's great to join you this evening. And our practice has been looking at the different food infrastructures mainly, and basically interrogating how food shapes the landscape that surrounds us. And since food, of course, is a very basic and rudimentary material that teaches us, or we are connected to in multiple ways, constantly on a continuous time span, we started to kind of investigate this material and see how through different relationships to the environment that surrounds us can we understand or kind of unearth different geopolitical power structures that create this landscape.
And I think for us, what we see is the human body and the landscape as one, effectively. How can we start thinking of those relationships as part of the same entity, and what kind of outcomes or consequences it has for that kind of interaction in terms of ecology, but also perception of space.
How to understand also how like different relationships or power structures are transgressing between these two, right? Like how the connection between different food items, crops, fruits, vegetables, and the body essentially are connected through a continuum from times of production, germination, to consumption and digestion.
Can you give us an example from maybe a recent project?
Maybe this project, one of the most recent ones we did in Scotland, in the Isle of Skye, and there we were trying to deal with the ecology of the island and the pollution of the water by fish farms, more precisely open net salmon farms, and basically how they are the ecology of the island. And there what we try to do is to think of systems that incorporate humans, but also other kinds of creatures under the water that by breathing, they also clean the water. For instance, oysters or different kinds of seaweeds or other bivalves that by existing, they are filtering the water in the same way that trees do with the air. And the installation that we created there underwater was both for those creatures, those agents that would be breathing and filtering water at high tides when the structure was covered in seawater in the tidal zone. And then at low tide, it would be a table or a structure for humans that we would put there to discuss these issues. So there would be these cycles throughout the day where sometimes it would be humans, sometimes other than humans, trying to rethink proactively the ecology of the island.
Susanne, could you tell us a little bit about your work?
It's a pleasure and honor to join in. I maybe start on this question with two concrete cases. The work we're presenting here as part of an art science project is a temporarily working title Desert Lab, and it looks into the narratives, the conflict lines, and also the transformations that happen not only through sea level rising, but also through desertification. And in this case here, we're looking at a particular place where under extreme living conditions and also growing, moving aridity line species and humans going through transformations. So we're looking into agencies of minerals, of stones in a part of this place here that's acidification. So you have a salt desert, and salt has been the gold of the medieval ages, but in these places it's a growing example of how places become unlivable, and still people have to deal on the borders with it. So we're kind of investigating concrete stories, but also how bigger transformations and maybe possibilities of dealing with it in terms of community work and in terms of smaller activism engagement. And also a huge part is creating awareness. So we're presenting an installation that brings in these aspects, and I think that's a little bit how I usually work. I start not necessarily with a conflict zone, but with an example of an ecosystem or an engagement that entangles human and non-human, and also questions this boundary between nature and culture. That's one of the problems that gets accelerated. So we try to get away with it, and involving other people and the many stories and poetics that are involved in that to create an attention.
Yeah, so there's two things I find really interesting about that. One, there's a relationship to what Cooking Sections was just talking about. So thinking about the human as not separate from everything else, from nature, from so on, from all of that. But also the way that you're thinking, because I would tend to think about other living things as having agency and engaging this conversation, but you're introducing these non-living things, minerals and so on, are things that we would normally think about as non-living. James, if you could talk a little bit about your work and how it's projecting, representing, investigating this relationship.
Hi. Thanks for having me as well. I work in many different ways that involve different modes of encounter, and there's no particular kind of theme that drives my work. So instead, I kind of set certain processes in action to see what happens and what I encounter along the way. So I tend to jump from maybe one subject to another. So I thought that maybe I would just introduce a little bit of a context of kind of one of the projects I'm working on, and then go into it a few more specifics. So if you just kind of bear with me, I've been working with a gallery in Edinburgh called Collective Gallery, while they've been in the process of moving from a site in the commercial area of the city to a kind of obsolete observatory on the top of a historically important hill in the kind of middle of the city. And a cluster of observatories were being built on this site over a 40-year period or so, from maybe the kind of late 1700s to the early 1800s, including the City Observatory, where the Astronomer Royal for Scotland would be based. But by the kind of late 1800s, the site became obsolete because of light pollution. And so the kind of city was kind of growing around this kind of site, and it was kind of coming into being kind of at the end of like Scotland's scientific and cultural golden age, like the kind of Scottish Enlightenment. It's part of a network of sites that was producing new ideas and discoveries, and as a result is connected to a number of characters, all of whom are men, and narratives that have come to dominate the history of the site and of Scotland in general. But my project involves developing new ways of observing from this position on the hill that might allow for a repositioning of the kind of dominant narrative, so to speak. So I've kind of been attempting to design and test a methodology that could sit within Collective's toolkit for seeing and seeking out new positions and ways of working. So one of these projects that I'm working on, there are three altogether, but the one that I think is the most relevant to the question and to the conversation today is about a woman called Margaret Stewart, who lived for part of her life at the foot of this hill. And she was the daughter of the minister responsible for the local area. But when her father died, she moved to London and married a famous astronomer called John Herschel. And early in their marriage, they relocated to Cape Town in order to build an observatory to study the stars from the south rather than north. And they were there like during the kind of 1830s. And during this time, the Cape Peninsula was obviously not populated in the same way it is now. It was organized very differently, of course. And they were kind of based in this kind of like on the kind of eastern edge of kind of Table Mountain. I don't know how well you know Cape Town, but and then they would kind of go on these excursions around the Cape, and they would collect plants and bulbs from which they made a bulb garden of native species. Okay, and these kind of excursions that they went on would give them a sense of how people lived, how they were connected to the land, and how the narratives and the realities of the colony were often being misrepresented back home in Britain. And these observations are recorded in like travel journals that they made and letters back home. And while they were there, Margaret Stewart, she learned to do botanical paintings and produced a portfolio of like 130 images, right, of the Cape flora, okay, that kind of represent what was growing there at the time. So, kind of, I spent some time in Cape Town, just 10 days, kind of last year, basically recreating one of these excursions. And the idea being to kind of to make my own portfolio of botanical drawings using images of the things growing along the route as it appears today, right? But the spine of this route is this kind of it's this amazing road, right? The M9, which kind of goes through it goes through wealthy suburbs, it goes through townships, it goes through beach resorts, it goes through conservation areas and so on. And much of the land along this route is contested in some way. So, you know, looking at the kind of Cape through land use reveals a lot about how the kind of economic and political relations are kind of formed, and the many contradictions and paradoxes that are kind of formed in post-apartheid South Africa. So, you know, as I'm sure you know, the Cape has one of the most important ecosystems in the world, and there are thousands of species of plant that exist only there, you know, sometimes just in like, you know, car parks or kind of little kind of corners of the kind of urban environment. And kind of looking at what's growing on the route also necessitates a set of encounters that forces one to kind of see firsthand many of the political and economic issues that have kind of formed and are underway at any one moment in time. So sometimes one can access certain sites, positions or ideas, sometimes you can't. Sometimes you have to ask permission from particular people to walk down a certain road, or to look at a piece of land, or to visit a conservation area and so on. So certain relationships need to be formed in order to perform the work. And this is essentially the challenge that was set, to understand something about the land through all these competing interests and stories. And the borders are always changing, and the kind of rights of the occupants are constantly in flux. And these are kind of where the paradoxes lie in this relationship between the bodies and the kind of land. The example I want to give is that of the kind of conservation areas that kind of exist within the kind of Cape Town boundaries. So these are sections of land that are kind of designated to be preserved so that what's left of the flora and the fauna and the wildlife can exist there kind of undisturbed by development. And these conservation areas, they vary in size and kind of in what's contained on them. So you get really enormous ones that take up many acres, and then you get really small ones that might be just like 2 blocks big. But they always border with different kinds of neighborhoods. So from temporary settlements to development sites to suburban houses, right? But because Cape Town's population is in constant flux, there are new people arriving all the time, right? And it's not uncommon for incomers to build shacks on these sites, or for kind of neighboring townships to expand into them. So when I was there were discussions about how, for example, the southeastern parts of Khayelitsha, which is the biggest township in Cape Town, are kind of extending into the Macassar Dunes, or the western edges of Winterling, which is a relatively new township, are extending into like the Drift Sands Nature Reserve. And these are kind of clear points of tension between bodies and land, and how each are understood and managed. So you get flashpoints on these borders, which are sometimes violent, because it's not always clear that these are conservation areas or why they're conservation areas, right? And it's kind of, someone with no home doesn't care so much about a rare species of grass, right? It's just, but it isn't just, poor people. So there are kind of also stories about kind of real estate developers building on conservation land without permission, because it's more economically expedient, to pay fines than it is to get permits. So there are all these kind of like stories and kind of flashpoints that are kind of, related to this kind of idea of the kind of human body kind of like, and the kind of landscape, and how they're kind of living or failing to live kind of side by side in this kind of area. And I guess, my project kind of, ultimately is a modest one. I'm just making 26 drawings of plants and flowers that are kind of encountered on the route. But the question of where these images were extracted from, I guess, are kind of where the possibilities for discussion within the context of Edinburgh and the site of the observatory in particular kind of like lies. So, the portfolio looks like a nice set of pictures made by an amateur botanist, right? And kind of many of the plants are recognizable because they're kind of global plants now. But beneath the surface of it, there are all these like problems lurking. I don't have the answers to any of those problems.
I want to ask you now about another kind of border crossing that I think operates in all of your work. You all have backgrounds that are sort of non-art backgrounds, or your practices all seem to come from a place outside of what we normally think about as art. So I'd like to hear a little bit about how those non-art backgrounds, so to speak, have fed or inflected your creative practice.
Well, for us, it's always a very interesting question and discussion that we have many times. And I think it's interesting that it comes up again and again, because I think it's a very interesting moment, which has been going for decades. But how do you reinvent disciplines, or how do you redefine what is disciplinary or outside the discipline? And for us, I think it always comes to a certain interest in the construction of space that can be approached through different media or disciplines or topics. And sometimes it's more through ecology, but other times it might be more through real estate speculation in other projects, right? I think it's more the kind of the search for these different forces, or understanding these different forces that construct power regimes or power structures, and then looking at them through the role of images, or the role of these interactions that we were talking about between ecology or human behavior or non-human behavior. And I think that for us is what's kind of the ultimate goal of our practice. Instead of thinking of it through the lens of contemporary art history as such.
It's true that we don't have a visual arts background. Yet again, I think we found quite a fertile ground within the cultural sector and the visual arts to work, as it many times opens a lot of opportunities to create collaborations with various professionals and craftsmen or scientists, biologists, etc., that can allow to create a field of inquiry, which I think for us is what pushes the work further at the end of the day.
And then instead of having like a predetermined position, we might come to a researcher who is an expert on, I don't know, a bacteria, and then we start the conversation from a kind of unexpected common field or there's no common ground as such from the beginning. I think that allows for, we find it a more exciting conversation instead of coming from the same discipline.
I kind of share some of the kind of desires that kind of Alan and Daniel just discussed, this kind of idea of a kind of generating kind of common ground between kind of disciplines. And I guess the way that I might talk about that is that, I mean, in some ways, I actually do have a mostly kind of art background, right? I kind of trained as an artist, and then I worked as a curator, and now I'm an artist again, right? But I kind of think curatorially. So I guess that kind of my work is kind of influenced by kind of what the kind of curatorial process reveals, okay? To point towards something maybe non-art, okay, that I've kind of come across through this kind of work that I kind of return to, and I think is a really useful lens to kind of see things. So one kind of practice that I maybe return to that I've kind of encountered in my work over the last few years is climbing. And kind of some years ago, I kind of worked with a guy called Dan Shipsides, who is an artist from Belfast, and he has this interest in climbing. And we did an event with him where he took a group of people from Manchester out into the Peak District, which is a kind of national park in the north of England. And, Dan talks about climbing in the same way that actually many of us talk about art, right? He kind of, and every kind of rock face is kind of like tells a kind of social and technical kind of history of kind of climbing, but also of the kind of world. And there are kind of many routes up and along kind of every rock face, but each one has been kind of named, authored and dated by the first person who performed it. So if you're a climber, right, you can see all of the routes when you look at a rock face, but they're invisible to kind of everybody else. And many of the kind of climbing pioneers of the kind of the rocks in the Peak District were also involved in the radical outdoor movements of the early 20th century, for example, which were about gaining access to land in England that was privately owned. So mass trespasses took place that were kind of primarily by working class walkers and climbers. And these are what led to the kind of creation of the national parks in Britain in the first place. So when Dan took us to the kind of Peak District, he gave us this kind of museum style tour of the rock face, right? As if we could see all the exhibits, which were of course invisible to us, but visible to him as a climber. And he would point out key routes by particular characters that led to a discussion of the social history of the region, right? Yeah. So, so that's kind of, I kind of find that a kind of interesting way of kind of reading the landscape. And interestingly, during the kind of time in Cape Town, I met a botanist who also happened to be a well-known climber, right? A guy called Ed February. If any of you are kind of climbers, you'll kind of know who this guy is. But, because he's Black, he had all kinds of trouble being a climber during the apartheid era, which, he was kind of barred from joining climbing clubs, and he was denied access to key sites for kind of climbers. But he was pretty good at getting around these restrictions. There are many like important climbs right all around Cape Town that are kind of authored by Ed. And it was basically being in close proximity to the land that led him to actually become a botanist through this kind of combination of climbing and botany. And also through his life in general in both the apartheid and post-apartheid eras. And then kind of, he's in this quite unique natural urban environment in Cape Town. And he has this particularly deep understanding of how space is organized and thought through all of these different structures that he's kind of encountered. So he has a very different view of the conservation areas, for example, than many of his colleagues. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I find this kind of thinking interesting when it's applied to exhibition making, for example. So, you know, that would be an example of a non-art kind of like scenario that I kind of draw from. You know, actually, my own background's pretty humdrum, unfortunately, so I'm kind of relying on other people's, I think.
So for you, it's been a kind of opposite direction.
Exactly.
From art and then moving into other non-art, quote unquote, spaces, but certainly related places through your art practice. Susanne, can you tell us a little bit about your background and how that, or your non-art backgrounds, and how that feeds into your creative practice?
Yeah, thanks. I would take that a little bit more simple, because I'm from a village and like a family that has been very much connected to the land in a existential way. So it's always something, not only like animals that kind of provide, but also like how the seasons, how the harvest, how everything kind of like makes the living and is actually the living. So a lot of the struggles that I engage with in the work now are feeling like connected to where I come from. The other thing is that, of course, parts of the structural violence are connected to like power structures and economic, social things that can be also similar in certain parts of the world. And a lot of them I have experienced, let's say, on our own skin.
What all of you have said is gesturing a bit to the next question, right? And so I want to ask you, you all live in Europe or are based in Europe, and you've all mentioned how through your work, yes, you're thinking about the relationship between human civilization. That relationship seems to speak to colonial relationships as well, or what we would think about as colonial relationships from our side of the world here in Jamaica. So I'd like to hear a little bit about how being based in Europe and dealing with this kind of work that references or unpacks to some degree colonial relationships. How do you mediate that in your practice, or do you, and what kinds of strategies do you use?
Well, I mean, it's a very long and complex question, but I think for us, we live today, we're based in the UK, but we weren't born in the UK. And I think when we moved into the UK 7 years ago, I think one of the ways coming to terms with London as a space had to do a lot with kind of understanding the history of the place and the history of its development and its relation to other parts of the world, whether we come from those or don't. And of course, one, like walking through a city like London or many other cities in the UK, London is not special in any way. You're encountered with this history, right? And the architecture and the urban fabric is a living testimony for this past. One of the first projects we did together, which was a 3-year-long process of looking into this food infrastructures that were put in by the British Empire and their contemporary legacy, was really to kind of come to terms with these spaces today we inhabit and what are the remains basically that we live among. In that sense, I think this is kind of something that, I think this idea of like the center that cannot hold is something that has been discussed for many decades. Still, there's a lot of work to be done, and there are a lot of questions to pose, and there's a lot of histories that have to be rewritten on a daily basis through historical, like more academic practices, but also through daily practices. And I think this is how our work at least engages with these kind of questions, and where also the question of the environment, of course, is crucial, because I think one of the things, of course, that a classic example that was mentioned before by you, James, right? This idea of like native species. And of course, one of the biggest questions is like native to where and to which period, right? And like, how do we start understanding these boundaries that have been created, which I think is something that you're completely addressing in your work. And I think these are the questions that we're constantly confronted by through the environment we live in, and try to kind of grapple with them, come to terms, or think of strategies how these could be shifted.
For me, working in this kind of as part of this kind of observatory in Edinburgh, the observatory is part of a kind of network of historical representations of Enlightenment thinking in the city, right? but it could also be seen, as you're kind of alluding to when you're talking about London, as part of a network of colonial thinking institutions that were kind of essential for Britain's project of organising and categorising and controlling the world. Okay, and it kind of represents this kind of a certain kind of paradox in that sense. And through kind of my work, I felt my Europeanness maybe also through certain privileges that are kind of to do with identity, that kind of grant me access to things that many of the people I met, like in South Africa, maybe are unable to access, And I'm also aware that the work itself has colonial undertones, right? In the sense that it's constructed from these documents that were kind of made during the height of colonialism by people who were only able to be in the places that they were because of the kind of colonial project. I'm wondering also whether I might kind of be able to address this question in terms of how the kind of colonial manifests itself when looking at the kind of huge problem of like poverty that is being kind of addressed in, like particularly in Cape Town. There's this kind of idea of how poverty is being addressed out with kind of government policy, perhaps in Cape Town, right? And there are kind of, and there's kind of the sense of the kind of colonial that exists within these kind of, okay, so there are the two positions, okay, one of which it's possible to encounter when you kind of go there, and one of which it's not. Firstly, there are kind of certain self-organized political groups that are kind of embedded within communities in the townships who are attempting to build what they call a politics from the ground up, right? And what's important to these groups is that the organizational forms and the discourse that they develop is inaccessible to outsiders, right? They don't want to allow access for kind of researchers and academics or artists or anyone from the political mainstream to kind of come in, however well-meaning they might be, because they don't want their discourse to be co-opted and fetishized and critiqued. They don't want, existing ideas being brought in. They don't want like their discourse colonized, basically. And they don't want their ideas to be extracted for use in existing political and academic discourse, right? So, that's kind of like one side of it. And then the kind of other side of it, there's this kind of approach that's taken by a number of kind of NGOs, right, that operate in the townships, which involves making practical use of apparently dead spaces, such as spaces under pylons or in abandoned lots or any other outdoor spaces that residents have easy access to around their homes. And these spaces are then used to grow vegetables or fruit, which can either be used to feed the grower's family or entered into a supply chain involving vegetable boxes that go out to subscribers all around the city. Okay. Mm-hmm. And there are kind of also organizations that do rewilding projects. Okay. So putting these kind of native species back like into the kind of ecosystem, but because many of these micro farms are growing non-native food plants like spinach, or okra. And these operations happen on various scales and so on and so forth. And they've helped many people. They've been running for decades. When I was kind of listening to the last podcast, listening to kind of TJ Demos talk about white environmentalism, this kind of idea of limiting global warming to just a bit instead of a lot, because then we don't have to change our lifestyles too much. Yes. And that kind of, the kind of NGOs are kind of, in a lot of ways, the kind of equivalent of this, they assume that they're kind of coming down from above, and kind of imagining that this is the best way, and they're kind of drip feeding like a little bit of stuff to kind of keep everything safe. It's a kind of colonization, in a sense, of the kind of political discourse, whereas these kind of the ground up politics seems to be more radical and appealing, but it will not gain traction if more and more people see this incremental improvement in their lives.
I know with your practice that you do travel quite a bit and work in many different spaces. So I'm interested to hear about your position from a European background, how you think some of those colonial relationships, or what are some of the navigations around that you see in your practice?
No, absolutely. I find the traveling for sure problematic, but on the other side, I find a lot of struggles kind of similar, and I find that there's an empowerment in kind of connecting people and also in seeing patterns. Like, I mean, a lot has been mentioned, what, I don't know, here also is called like green capitalism or ecotourism. And I don't think it's so easy that like so many people know how to resist, or that, that there are easy strategies, because a lot of development, regardless if it's NGO or government driven, has, because of funding of foreign companies, has also a new disguise of colonialism. So yes, on my personal level, I try to be like critical, like, is this really necessary? And why do I engage there? What is like my position in that particular space? And if it doesn't make sense, or it's not specific and not necessary, then I also think like I'm suspicious to it in relation to artist projects, because a lot of like culture as well as NGO is like very complicit with these new forms. But on the other side, like working on entangling and kind of looking into how do these dynamics, for example, function, and how do fishermen organize themselves, or how do, the camel breeders unions get like a better publication with some of the people here, like working with direct propaganda, that there are very direct ways of kind of supporting the struggle in a maybe old school internationalist way, where I see these new forms of colonialism can be counteracted. And part of that might also be through an international solidarity, but not in each case. So it's a very tricky question, and it's for sure something that is a huge guideline in, let's say, my recent projects. Like in this concrete case here, a lot of the development.
Where is here for you right now?
This is a project in a very special ecosystem, a desert inside India, that faces particular threats through climate change, that the EU has also kind of been involved in trying to help through this like biodiversity programs. And at the same time, a lot of structures are actually exactly like old colonial structures. Like, for example, around like a certain pigment, like the indigo has like a huge history in Indian colonialism. But now it's kind of like promoted by the government and has the same kind of like disregard to like community work, or the people actually living from working with that plant. I think it has to be like rendered locally and like very specifically entangled. And the problem is that new forms of colonialism and the old ones are reproducing.
I'd like to hear a little bit about how you all are thinking about climate debt. And let's start with Danielle and Alon, who might be able to give us a little framework for that.
I think it's very interesting as a question, or as a field of inquiry. I think in our work, the way we've been trying to deal with these questions, and still the ongoing violence and inequality that is generated, was to look at also what Susanne was mentioning a bit. I think there's some similarities in that kind of approach, is how do we look at these new forms of colonization that is still going on, and that still the same countries are taking advantage of. And in that sense, also the course we teach, and some of the works that we've been producing within that topic, is this idea of the financialization of the environment, and this idea of carbon colonialism, or how all these kind of greenifying the planet and making us feel good is all based still on a logic of inequality through offsetting, be it offsetting of pollution or offsetting of credits that deal with the extraction of value from the environment. And that, of course, climate plays a big role in that. And in a way, we've shifted from a logic of, let's say, the old kind of binary of developing and developed nations to this idea of low carbon emitting and high carbon emitting nations, right? And who has the right to pollute and who has the obligation to cleanse,
yes.
Which is still replicating exactly the same systems, but through the angle of we're doing good to the planet on one side of the planet, and because someone else will deal with that, or will deal with the offset of that pollution or emissions of CO2, etc., etc. So again, like, how do we critically look at the way that climate and pollution is being traded today. Maybe gives us some clues of ways to rethink those relationships.
Are there any alternatives that you generated, or are there ways that you're thinking about something else we could do that doesn't adopt that structure?
What we sometimes try to do is to think of platforms that try to address that, at least to raise certain awareness. It's a bit hard always to think of solutions and alternatives, because that's kind of the big kind of ambition of humanity. What we sometimes try to do is to set up platforms or different spaces of discussion of those issues through things like, for instance, cohabitation, and how do we think of other forms of cohabitation. And for instance, part of the Empire Remains shop, one of the projects that we did was to open the devaluing real estate agency, right? And had to think of forms of devaluation and degrowth as part of alternatives. Not as something negative, which is negative for certain market structures, but also has some positive consequences for other forms or other understandings of value. And then, how could we implement a logic of degrowth and devaluation as part of that shift? That's kind of, for us, one possible scenario.
And Susanne, you started touching on some of this already in what you were saying, but how does the idea of climate debt figure into your work?
Yeah, I mean, as maybe it, I only talked about the project here now, but it's also connected to a bigger research project that where I also met you guys recently, and that is located in the Caribbean. And when we started working on this, one of the elements that came necessary was to work with an environmental lawyer, and also to work with someone who, from like a bigger framework position, works on the entanglement of social and ecological justice. And I think these became not only key collaborators, but they're also, like in my project, the ones that define like how this whole topic of rights of nature is one that cannot be taken away from the depth of climate and also of colonialism. So I'm trying to, let's say, this knowledge that I don't have, or that I'm maybe only scratching on, to collaborate with people who have a better view. Like, for example, the environmental lawyer also being involved in making these reclaims for also Germany for slavery. So I see that in a practice, in the people that I work with, as a necessity to connect. In a bigger framework, it's also something that's an obligation and a commitment, let's say, for a country like Germany that was maybe not the main colonial, but also has never really worked on its colonial history. And I see it a question of commitment to the topics.
I'll just say one sentence just based on what Susanne was saying there as well, is that like similarly to kind of this question of, I also think that Scotland is not doing a great job of addressing its kind of complicity in kind of in empire building, and I think that probably has something to do with the fact that it sees itself as being kind of ruled by England. Okay, so it means that it always is like it also adopts a kind of like, it kind of adopts a kind of a position of being, colonized and controlled itself, which is preventing it from thinking through many of these questions.
The project collective, I've been to the site.
Yes. Uh-huh.
And I think it's really interesting that there's this manifestation of, Enlightenment ideas. For us on this side of the world, and Enlightenment ideas are always a little bit complicit with the
absolutely, yeah.
Some of that thinking through that you're doing through that space, I think, touches on some of these issues. In general, we tend to separate the local and the global, right? This is something you hear all the time, local-global, as if they're always discrete. But I think some of your work is speaking to the ways that they're not always discrete, right? One of those relationships is that, for example, the spaces globally and locally that are normally the most environmentally vulnerable to climate events, places like the Caribbean, are spaces where the people and land have been most exploited historically. Do you think that your practice connects to these kinds of conversations happening in very decentralized local places across the globe?
The stuff that I'm currently working on is kind of essentially about, mapping one space onto another through time and through space, and kind of seeing what that reveals. And it kind of attempts to disrupt the kind of dominant narratives. And by this, I mean the narratives presented by people in power, like locally or globally, who are presenting a particular image of a place or what a place is and what a place does. And I suppose that my work attempts to make connections that aren't usually visible. So because the stuff that I'm making is generally presented kind of back home, so to speak, back in kind of, in Britain or in Scotland or in kind of, Glasgow or Edinburgh, I would hope that it would make people question their understanding of other spaces and their own spaces and how they think about those, like these kind of disparate kind of connections a little bit more. So, rather than kind of following the usual lines of inquiry to kind of reach an understanding of a place, that one might disrupt those narratives.
As creatives, do you have ideas on how creative practice can help restructure our geopolitics so that the resources that exist worldwide are used in a more equitable way?
Maybe for us, or in our work, maybe we can connect it to an episode in the Caribbean that we found very inspiring when we were doing some research in Cayman. And there in the Department of the Environment, they had to deal with the issue around lionfish, which for those people who don't know, we learned a lot about it there. We hadn't heard about it before. And it's this fish that has been taking over the ecology of the sea in different Caribbean islands, and basically they eat anything that is smaller than him. And the way that the Department of the Environment there was, or is still trying to deal with it, is by creating a cultural shift, and in order to start generating a sort of culture of eating it, but also of fishing it, because it's very hard to fish. It has to be done with a spear and etc. etc.
Yes, because they're quite poisonous. So
exactly. Yeah. So it's poisonous. Yeah. If they touch you, it's like a bit of a jellyfish, let's say. So how to they were organizing all these tournaments to give prizes to people or the ones who would fish the most amount in a day, as the only way to bring back the population of other species of fish that are disappearing because of it. And not only that, but also connecting it to local restaurants to serve it as a dish. And for us, what is fascinating about that kind of approach is also the way it challenges culture and cultural heritage. And we like to think of it as almost like a national dish that has a sort of expiration date. Let's say that maybe in 10 years, when the ecology is rebalanced, or other fish or sharks learn how to eat lionfish, maybe we don't need to eat it anymore, and it becomes kind of unpackable. And then you create this national dish that is not forever, or is not heritage forever, but rather cultural structures with expiration date.
I think we took from that a lot of we learned a lot from that approach. I think always the challenge with an artistic practice is like, how do you actually penetrate, and if you need to, but I think that's another question. But for us, it is always interesting and the most challenging, like how do you infiltrate or manage to kind of use governmental structures in order to create these kind of changes, right? How does it not stay only as a commentary on society or as a kind of speculation about the possible future, but moves into an action that can have like ripples into existing structures?
Yeah, I think that there's definitely potential to think about that incident of the lionfish and the government's response to that as a form of creative practice in and of itself.
As a tiny, let's say, mini slogan, I guess I tried to use geopoetics against geopolitics, resisting maybe direct representation and trying to work with relations that are more complex, but that can also use different senses in terms of like connecting to people's struggle, but also connecting to ways of enjoying and empowerment.
I'm familiar with your project around bioluminescence, for example, and some of the work that you've done to scale up these tiny bacteria that produce bioluminescence to a human scale, or a scale that allows for encounter with a human, right? Maybe you could tell us a little bit about that, because I think that that's one project that kind of grounds what you were just talking about.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's one way. That's maybe like a strategy as well, like looking into the life or the life forms that are disregarded. I mean, the bioluminescence, of course, has also something magic, but like algae is usually the biomass that no one wants to look at, or in this project here, sand or certain plants that you want to get rid of, but then to take their agency and maybe look into their stories, and then that actually kind of entangles immediately humans and kind of people that are connected to it in a sensual way, through the stories and through the healing processes, through other ways that, does not have to be like intellectual or political on the first sense, but you're kind of creating structures of connections, and you're all of a sudden highlighting or looking at something from a different perspective. Let's say a dialogue with an algae or like an army of algae. So you're creating kind of a universe. In this case here, we're really actually writing science fiction stories around the desert and the engagement of the people there, not as like another apocalyptic scenario, but like as imagining a different possibility of interaction, of seeing energy in a certain plant that can actually stop the desert, and looking at that plant, which is actually super beautiful, but you can also look at it as something that's disregarded from a lot of sides. So this is what I mean, like, Poetics sometimes uses this, like looking at the tiny microscopic and then blowing it up and kind of talking to it as if it would be a star constellation, and the same way around. So these kind of like imaginary scenarios, I think, is something that as an artist we use, or we try to use, and then we engage even in different struggles with the people in their reality.
If you could each just tell me what you're super excited about that you're working on right now that we can all look out for.
One thing that we're not working on anymore, but we are very excited that it's happening, is that our book about the Empire Remains shop is coming out in a couple of weeks, and we'll be launching it in New York, and then in April 13 at eFlux, and then at the showroom in London on May 14th. And then we're currently working on 2 exhibitions, one in Palermo and one in Paris, that will open later in the summer.
And then also with the book, what we're trying to do is to offer that format of the Empire Remains shop as something that we want to think as a counter franchise or a franchise for other people to open the Empire Remains shop in other places.
James?
I have one thing coming up, which I'm very excited about in the next few weeks, which is an exhibition at Chapter 13, and we have an exhibition that's part of Glasgow International Festival, which is opening at the end of April, and it's an exhibition based on none of the things we were talking about today, actually, but it's based on the activities of an American guy, a forger, who's not actually really a forger. His name's Mark Landis, and he spent 25 years trying to become a philanthropist, but he didn't have any money, so he was making forgeries of like paintings, and then he was taking them to museums and donating them to their collections in order to become a philanthropist, right? And he's an amazing character, very interesting character. He got into a lot of trouble about 7 or 8 years ago for his activities. He got like outed in the press, and basically there's this kind of narrative about him that is that he's a kind of forger and that he's a kind of dissident of some kind. But I'm really interested in the because there's always a discussion around the objects and what the objects are, that these really great forgeries, but actually these objects are simply kind of props that he's using as a means to kind of meet curators and play this kind of philanthropist character. So we've made an exhibition based around this, in which a group of artists have kind of responded to this idea of the encounter that he's kind of having with curators in museums. So it's got the I'll do a bit of promotion and say that the 7 artists are Bianca Baldi, Nina Liebenberg, Sarah Pierce, Alex Impey, who've gotten Alexandra Sokayeva, Irina Georgi, and I've forgotten someone. I'm in trouble for that. We'll have to edit it in later.
No worries.
I'll remember in a minute. So that's it. That's me.
Susanne, what are you working on now? You told us you're in India.
Okay, yeah, we launched the first, let's say, report from the field trip of the Desert Lab here today. There will be a publication coming out, and there will be a traveling show end of 2018 in Mumbai coming out of this. And the project I'd like to feature in your show, the Rights of Nature show, more is, okay, and a tiny thing with Kapwani Kivanga in 2 weeks, which will also feature the bioluminescent plants and a lot of the topics that you have been speaking about. But I also have the first grant and research from the Ministry for the Rights of Nature project in the sense of claiming an ecosystem as a legal entity for UNESCO World Heritage in Jamaica, and that project also has just started now. So I'd like to feature that one.
Thank you very much, guys.
Thank you for listening to In. Join us for our next episode, a conversation focusing on creative practices addressing Afro-Latinidad.